Okay, so this is the Tapestry continued, and we are on chapter 3. In Switzerland and other European countries, when a child is 11, a very special set of school examinations is taken, the results of which determine a direction, whether the child is going to go on to enter a college classique or a secondary school course of study. Each of these leads to a very different set of possibilities for the future. Without any such formal examinations, without any realization that a period of preparation was now being entered, Fran's 11th birthday ushered in a special period. However, all that could have been observed by anyone looking on at the time would have been Fran's change of schools from the grammar school to Roosevelt Junior High School. Two important things took place the first day. First, Fran entered the homeroom of Mrs. Liddy C. Bell, who was to be the first person to open doors to him. Just a crack, but doors into another world nevertheless, as she taught art, appreciation, and drawing. This wasn't anything cataclysmic, but it was an introduction to another world of whose existence he hadn't known before. Second, Fran took steps to make sure he would not be going to college, lining up subjects that would please his parents: mechanical drawing, woodwork, electrical construction, and metalwork at a forge. This emphasis of subjects carried through high school in an ironic turn away from academics. Hey, buddy. Just as a new interest was opened in fresh areas. Here's a picture of him.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy that at 11 they would determine a path in America?
No.
His grades were up and down, as incentive was very sketchy, although in general the average was above normal. That same year he joined the Boy Scouts, a year ahead of the age for joining. Representing his troops, he entered a scout speech contest and won. I have his cup here to copy. Pyramid Club Cup 4-minute speech contest won by Francis A. Schaeffer, Troop 38, 1923. That was the year his father had told him to, quote, choose a new church, any one you want to go to. And he had chosen the First Presbyterian Church of Germantown because of the scout troop. In working for various merit badges, Fran learned things about trails and woods, which stood him in good stead later in the alpine hiking he did, and gave him summer camp as well to look forward to right then. A YMCA membership from his father opened the way for him to learn to swim and to do a certain amount of gymnastics. Music lessons started this same year turned out to be a fiasco, as Fran had a, quote, total incompatibility with the piano teacher, and he gave up. His playing the cymbals in the scout band also had a swift ending, as he got the idea all mixed up, so it seems, wanging away in a manner that flattened the cymbals, as well as coming in at the wrong time. Music, at least as a performer, was clearly not his talent. I wonder if he had that, like a body dyslexia, almost like Joseph's had.
Yeah.
Like when you watch him on the piano. In the winter, there was sledding down hills, where today you would find thickly populated suburbia. Do you remember the old flexible flyer sleds with runners divided to allow steering? The front half was hitched to the bar, which our hands grasped when he went, quote, belly flopping, as we used to call lying flat on one's tummy while flying down the hill. Woe be to anyone who went straight into a wall in such a position. Sledding straight towards a frozen little pond one frosty winter's day, Fran flew merrily out over the ice when, crack, the ice broke. Into the icy water he fell as the jagged edges lowered him and his sled through the too thin ice. It was not tragic, as he was able to climb out and get his sled out too, but the walk home was a not-to-be-forgotten time of misery. Another misery experienced by Fran, a very severe case of scarlet fever, dates back to that period. In those days, any contagious disease had to be reported to the city health officer by the physician in attendance. In very short order, a man would appear at the front door, make an announcement to anyone who opened the door that he had been sent to, quote, place to quarantine. And with no more discussion, he would get out his hammer, 4 nails, and a white cardboard placard, which measured, as I remember, about 16 inches square. This placard would have in very heavy letters information needed by all passers-by, so that they could keep from passing by. Quarantine. Under the ominous word would be even larger letters elucidating the nature of the quarantine. Mumps, or measles, or chickenpox, or whooping cough, the placards would announce. One of the most dreaded signs was placed on the door of that little house: scarlet fever. Below this enormous word would come smaller print telling of the fine that would be levied upon any person or persons removing the sign. The only person permitted to take out those tacks and remove the solemn warning was a health officer officially designated for the task. It was a serious thing to be under quarantine, but for Fran it was an even more serious time because he really was dangerously ill. His fever soared and delirious dreams continued for 3 or 4 days and nights. To this day, he remembers the dreams vividly, and he says the only way he could know that the monsters in them were not reality would be the sight of his mother's blue dust cap floating into view as she came to give him a sip of some cool drink. Sometimes people forget what diseases were like before sulfa and then penicillin and other antibiotics were discovered. Survival was not taken for granted, and the hush of an approaching crisis and days of soaring fever meant a tiptoe situation in the house, with anxious inquiries by neighbors staying a respectful distance from any germs that might float out the doorway. Fran remembers his father coming to the window once a day. Recovery time was longer too. Viruses may be fighting back today, but there are differences younger people can't have a feeling about because of being unaware of what the, quote, before was like in a variety of areas of life. Before electricity is a meaningless phrase to anyone who has always lived with a nearby switch for light or an outlet into which to plug such a diversity of equipment. Gas lamps and gas stoves may still be chosen and appreciated, even thought of as a luxury, but there are not many Americans, English, Europeans, Australians, or people in a variety of electricity-oriented places who can appreciate the excitement of the switch from gas lights to electric lights with the kind of thrill people had back there when, ... Picture a slim boy wiggling through places in the attic too small for Pop to crawl through, fishing the wires through, and helping to get the whole house ready for the change from gas to electricity. This, of course, fit in with what he was learning in school about electricity, giving him a base for feeling kinetically with his hands all through life, that which workmen were doing. As the next years went on, Fran was to do every kind of work with his dad: laying floors, building a garage, bricklaying, mending gutters on the roof, remaking a coal bin in the cellar, plumbing work, cement work, etc. And as the first little house was sold, the new larger house on Ross Street needed fixing up. By the time this move took place, Fran was in Germantown High School. It was not until the junior year of high school, when Fran was 17, that the, quote, big things happened to him, which led him to Christianity. His life before he became a Christian, in retrospect, seems to him something like a film being seen through a mist, something almost outside of himself. The new birth was a vivid reality to him, with no relationship to emotion, but to the very substance of life. He says the years of junior high and high school were a period separated from childhood, as well as from the reality of the next steps. There were no, quote, dropouts in those days, but inwardly Fran had, quote, dropped out. What was the use? There seemed no reason to push on, so he simply did, in a machine-like sort of way, the series of things which seemed to come along, without a great interest in any of it. Outwardly, what would you have seen? A growing boy going to school, joining the rifle club, leading Cub Scouts, playing basketball once a week at the church, roller skating at the rinks, designing and making forged iron things like candlesticks or wall brackets, and working on Saturdays. He took a job on a fish wagon, shouting, "Fish, fresh fish," with such fervor that he feels it must have been his training for public speaking. Housewives would hear that voice through closed doors and come running with their baskets. Finally, he quit the job because the man was so cruel to his horse that Fran couldn't stand it. The next Saturday job consisted of working for a meat market at Reading Terminal, an hour's trolley ride into town. After enduring freezing hands to unpack meat in the ice-cold room, he helped deliver it. The day's work was from 5 a.m. to 5 p.m. Another job entailed scaling a steam boiler, using a hammer and a chisel to scrape sediment from the inside until Fran thought his lungs would burst. A different experience was delivering ice, which included tossing 200-pound cakes of ice in the ice house for loading purposes. He then turned to making beaded flowers that were popular at the time as pins. He taught his mother and some of her friends to make them for him, developing a small, quote, factory situation for which he became the salesman and sold them by the dozens to Wanamaker's department store and some other stores. When he joined Sigma Delta Kappa fraternity, the initiation consisted of the old members taking their new pledges out into a vacant lot, covering them with molasses and birdseed, amid much hooting and demanding, "Whistle like birds now, go on." The hitch in this performance came when police ran in. Thinking the boys were covered with blood, they hustled them into a paddy wagon and let the explanations come in the station house. Although Fran was the youngest and not the leader, he was chosen as the official spokesman, and evidently told such a plausible account of it all, through his birdseed-covered lips, that they were all sent away with simply a warning, "Don't do it again." The crack in the wall concerning the existence of art filled in with moss, so to speak, in this period of time, but another such crack came unexpectedly. One day, Fran went with the scout troop to an electrical show held at the City Auditorium, now very near Dr. Chick Coop's hospital, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, where so recently we were all together for filming. The most spectacular part of that electrical show was a playing of Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture, with stage props simulating buildings, castles, etc. Cannons boomed, houses fell, drums rolled, and the music played to its crashing finale. This was a first piece of classical music that broke into Fran's ears and understanding. A few days later, when he turned on the radio, out poured the 1812 Overture, his friend. In joyous recognition, he pressed his ear against the speaker so as not to miss any of it, and a love for classical music was born, which was to grow as soon as opportunity came to hear more. At Sunday school, a teacher who is not much help in biblical things was, however, the next person to, quote, open a door, when he got Fran to helping a white Russian count to learn to read English. The count's idea of a beginning book to read was the uncensored account of the life of Catherine the Great. After a few weeks of this, Fran said, "You're never going to learn English this way." The count was ready to agree, and that week Fran took a trolley into the Philadelphia's famous bookstore, Leary's, and asked for a beginner's English reading book. Fran has always been a bit overwhelmed by the providence of God that sent him home with the wrong book, a book on Greek philosophy. As he began to read, he felt as if he had come home. From this time on, his interest flared like a fire that has had gasoline poured on it, and he read everything he could get his hands on. He would wait until his parents were asleep, then turn on his light again and read on into the night. It was exciting to be stimulated into thinking in the basic philosophic areas, but as time went on, he felt that all he was getting was defined questions with no answers. As Fran considered what he was hearing at church every Sunday, he felt there was a parallel. The preaching was just as devoid of answers. "I wonder," he mused to himself, "whether, to be honest, I should just stop calling myself a Christian and discard the Bible." What he had really become was an agnostic. Then he reconsidered and faced the fact that he had never read the whole Bible in his life. Since at this time he was reading Ovid, he decided that before discarding the Bible, he'd read some of Ovid and some of the Bible night by night. Gradually, he put aside Ovid altogether, not to finish it until he read it in the original Greek in college, and spent all the time he had to read on reading the Bible. How did he read it? Who helped him to understand? No one gave him any suggestions. He wouldn't have known who to ask, and in any case, he had no idea there was any way to read it other than to read it in the same way as any other book. He started at the beginning of Genesis and read to the end. If you want to know why Fran has such a high regard for the Bible and feels it is adequate in answering the questions of life, the answer is right here. As a 17-year-old boy with a thirst for the answers to life's questions, he began to discover for himself the existence of adequate and complete answers right in the Bible. Have you ever read Christina Rossetti's Sunshine Country? The story of a little shepherd boy who finds the Gospel of Mark in a cave in the hills and goes back every day to read more of the story. Remember his excitement and sheer wonder in finding what he thought no one else had ever discovered before? This was the same way in which Fran discovered truth as he read. As we talked about it today, he said with deep emotion at the clear memory of that time, "What rang the bell for me was the answers in Genesis, and that with these you had answers, real answers. And without these, there were no answers either in philosophies or in the religion I had heard preached." Sometime in the next 6 months, Francis Schaeffer became a Christian. He believed and bowed before God, accepting Christ as his Savior, having come to an understanding directly from the Word of God itself. He thought he had discovered something no one else knew about. He thought what he had found was unique, and that he alone had found it. If what he had discovered was being a Christian, then he thought he was the only one. But he didn't call himself that. It was a transforming reality that changed his whole outlook. It began to change his marks at school and the way he looked at the woods. But for a time, he did not know there was anyone else who shared this truth he felt he had discovered. You see, he thought Christianity was what he had heard preached by an old-fashioned liberal who gave ethical talks and who did not preach biblical truth. At that time, Fran was totally ignorant of the fact that there was any other kind of preaching. An obstetrician will tell you that births are very unpredictable. Diversity is something that is demonstrated by the difference in human beings lying in the tiny cribs in a hospital nursery, even though they may all be the same age. The individuality of each human being is in terrific contrast to the boring exactness of machine-made objects. The spiritual new birth is also a very individual matter. Each person enters the family of the Lord or becomes one of God's people through the blood of Christ, or on the basis of Christ's finished work on the cross. Yet each new child of God is an individual and is significant, important, personal to God, who receives them one by one into his family. As we focus on one part of the tapestry, and our short lives can't enable us to focus on more than a minimal proportion of the whole, we can look forward with expectancy to having all eternity to discover something of the fantastic variety of not only how people have found truth and come to believe, but of how God then wove them into history. There isn't any person, including ourselves, I believe, who won't be surprised to see how it all fits together, and just what our part was after all. I think that seeing through a glass darkly, or seeing in part, means this, as well as other things. There was no set of blueprints suddenly dropped into Fran's lap. He saw no handwriting on the wall. He heard no voice in his ear telling him that there would be a change in direction. He simply went on to high school, and the theme he wrote for English not only began to have more content to them, but the writing improved drastically. He was the treasurer of the senior class Washington trip, which gave him his first view of the world outside of Philadelphia and Atlantic City, was the secretary of the class, or co-secretary perhaps it should be called, as they had one boy and one girl secretary, and graduated in June 1930, but with no expectation of going on to college, heading toward Drexel Institute to study engineering. Fran's father had given him a new Model A Ford for graduation. The cost was $567.
Wow.
His diary notations, he started to keep a diary at this time, tell of his driving lessons, then of going to the art museum for the first time, and also of a continuous series of trips to a library in the city to supply his increasing activity in reading. He began to look for a job, but with the Big Depression well underway, it wasn't easy to find anything. House painting jobs, thoughts on Carl Sandburg, movies that he had seen, jobs he was doing for his dad and fixing up the new house, purchase of his first razor and suit, these and the like assortment of things filled his diary for a time. Then came one of the crisis notations, one of the milestones to be recorded. And we'll pick up with that next time.
So good. I
Yeah.
love that story.
It is good.